Hello and welcome to this edition of the Homeland Defense and Security Information Analysis Center HDIAC podcast. This podcast is a two-part series featuring an interview with the 37th Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, General Robert Neller, retired, and Stephen Redifer, Director of HDIAC.
We are privileged to host General Robert Neller, the 37th Commandant of the Marine Corps, for the latest episode in our ongoing video podcast series. A native of East Lansing, Michigan, General Neller graduated from the University of Virginia and was commissioned in 1975. He has served as an infantry officer at all levels, including command of the Marine Security Force Company Panama during Operations Just Cause and Promote Liberty, 3rd Light Armored Infantry Battalion during Operation Restore Hope, 6th Marine Regiment, and the 3rd Marine Division. Prior to becoming Commandant, he served as the Commander, Marine Forces Command, and Commander, Marine Forces Central Command. General Neller also served as Deputy Commanding General, 1 Marine Expeditionary Force Forward during Operation Iraqi Freedom 05-07, Assistant Division Commander for 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions, and President of the Marine Corps University. Thank you for joining us today, General. I greatly appreciate the time that you're putting into this effort.
Yeah, Colonel Redifer, Steve, good to see you again. And I look forward to the discussion and appreciate that you're still involved and engaged in trying to make us better.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the kind words. So we'll go ahead and get started, sir. I want to talk to you quite a bit about science and technology. Throughout your experience in the Marine Corps, I think that you have a lot to offer. And throughout your career, you saw many changes to the world landscape and the corresponding national security focus of the United States. In your time, ranging from the Vietnam War through the Cold War and most recently, the global war on terrorism. Shortly after assuming the office of the Commandant, you wrote and published Fragmentary Order 01-2016, Advance to Contact. In that, you emphasized that innovation necessitates making hypotheses about the future operating environment. Along those lines, in your opinion, what poses the greatest external threat to the national security of the United States, in your thoughts?
Well, the normal response to that would be a particular potential adversary, but the United States is a unique nation and culture, and sometimes we don't respond well to things unless they get really, really bad. I mean, I remember one of the things I got to do as the Commandant was I got to meet and talk with some very interesting people, and one of those people was a guy named Steve Hansen, who was the coach of the New Zealand national rugby team, the All Blacks. And we were just talking, and I asked him, and we were talking about culture and building teams and how they selected their team. And he said, well, what I really had to do is I had to make everybody believe that we didn't have to lose to learn. And I thought about that a lot. The United States, if you look at our history, changes have come out of bad outcomes.
Yes, sir.
Where we were surprised, or we didn't anticipate, or we weren't ready, or we were willing to accept a certain level of risk. And so I'm not saying that's where we are today. I think the National Defense Strategy written in 2018 lays out a number of things that recognizes that we don't want to have to lose to learn. And we don't want to have something bad happen. But the environment we're in, particularly with the digitization of all things, the internet of all things, where things that air traffic control, power grids, water, utilities. I mean, we just saw that. I live in Texas. We just saw that with the winter storm, where the weather, significantly disrupted the ability to move the power grid around and maintain, electricity and heat and the delivery of natural gas for people to heat their homes.
Yes, sure.
Or the ability for the water system to work and continue to keep the water clean and flowing where pipes broke, or, So I think technology is great, and it makes us go faster and makes things better. But I think we always have to keep in mind that there are consequences of this that we have to figure out how to mitigate before something bad happens. And so that's what I worry about. We've created a war, talking specifically about defense, we've created a methodology which goes back to the precision of the revolution of military affairs, post Desert Shield, Desert Storm, with global positioning system and the digitization of communications, and we've further refined that. But within those capabilities, the reliance on space and the ability to move communications and data through all sorts of different means, we've created vulnerabilities.
Sure.
And those vulnerabilities have got to be taken into account. So that's what I worry about. And again, our adversaries, some of them, potential adversaries, they have the same or similar vulnerabilities. So I've said this many times when I was on active duty. To me, if there is going to be a fight, that side that can sustain their network or bring their network back and have a more resilient network faster, better than the other party, than the other person you're up against, you're going to win. You're going to win.
Yes, sir. Yeah, thank you very much for that, sir. I appreciate you also mentioning the Internet of Things too. I think that's something that we'll come back to as we continue the discussion, is that edge of technology and maximizing that technology to your benefit. But again, as you said, that creates inherent vulnerabilities that are open to prosecution by an enemy that is agile. So one of your priorities as Commandant, and through my association with you during our time together, was in the area of modernization and technology. So in your nearly 45 years of service in uniform and your continued service to our country, what was the biggest change you witnessed in warfighting technology, do you think?
Well, that's, you put it in context. As you said, I joined in 1975, right after we had withdrawn from Vietnam. I mean, to give you some context, the first unit I was in, we had, the gear we had from Vietnam, and there was no global positioning system. There was no digital comms. There was one radio, if it worked, that gave you encrypted communications. Later on, even in early 80s, I was a company commander. I had a total of 8 radios to command and control an infantry company. Now, if we had other forward observers or other attachments come in, they brought radios, but those were single channel radios that were on a single net, ability to pass data to the demand for bandwidth in the network, to see on the other side of the hill, if you will, or to provide real-time intelligence. All that would have been a science fiction movie back in the 70s and 80s. But again, as we talked about before, those things bring with it certain capabilities and enhance your ability to be successful on a battlefield. But at the same time, they create dependencies and they create vulnerabilities. So I'm not saying one's better. I think the technology clearly makes you more effective than where we were before. But if you lose that, you lose the ability to read a paper map. If you lose the ability to fly distances over time without some technology to help you find your way, and it's entirely possible that capability might not be there, at least intermittently. If it may not be there at all, how are you then going to operate? And then you have, okay, if I have to train these lesser degraded capabilities as backups or alternatives, where do I find the time to do this in addition to do all the other stuff I need to do? So it's a difficult problem. So we still teach our second lieutenants, basic map and compass at the basic school, and whether they continue to use that when they get out to the operating force. I know that the Navy they had foregone using astrological data, sextants and things to shoot the stars to try to find their position on the planet because they were so comfortable with the nav aids that they had and GPS. Now they've gone back to teaching that again. Because, again, people have realized, just like we would take that away from an adversary would do their very, very, very best in the very initial outset of a conflict to take that away from us. So that's probably the biggest change. I mean, there's so many, whether it's biogenetics, whether it's DNA mapping, whether it's additive manufacturing and 3D printing, which I still believe, and I mean, it's happening. I don't believe it. I know it is totally going to disrupt, or is disrupting the supply chain. And in many ways for the better, particularly for a forward deployed military force that's an expeditionary nature like the Marine Corps, being able to print your own parts, to 3D print your own habitability, maybe one day even your own food, is going to give you a huge operational advantage.
Yes, sir. I suspected, I wondered if you might go, when we started talking about GPS and the map and compass, I think it is a classic example in the world that even I grew up in when I was a lieutenant. I remember the very first GPS for the entire battalion kind of being fielded. But I also remember standing out on a hill and trying to figure out where the enemy was to call artillery and that sort of thing, in that trial and error type perspective. It was a good skill that was complementary, but I also sympathize with the idea there's only so many hours in a day to teach all the old stuff and all the new stuff as well. So, sir, technological change is accelerating today just simply at an unprecedented rate. It's amazing that, to me, that we had no computers in a platoon or a company when I was a lieutenant. There wasn't even such a thing as a PC when you were a lieutenant. And now our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines are walking around with that computing power literally in their pocket. And it can create a world that we can barely begin to imagine, yet I think, as you said, leaders got to be cognizant of this change and make decisions today that are going to affect our ability to leverage the technology into the future. So it's hard to imagine. We've already talked, as little as 30 years ago, use of GPS wasn't prevalent, yet today it's in every phone. You can't even get money out of a cash machine without GPS being involved. So how do we balance this imperative of modernizing existing systems while simultaneously fielding usable systems quickly? And then we all want the next generation leap in technology. We don't want to buy a bunch of something today that is outdated tomorrow. So I know that's a very difficult question, but I'm curious as to your thoughts on that.
Well, you just hit on the ultimate conundrum, or the ultimate problem for I think not just for the military, but for any organization that has large capital infrastructure. And so the military, the problem has been, how do you maintain current operations with the current set of equipment that you have? How do you maintain this equipment and upgrade it so that you're able to do these operations? And then how do you invest and field at the same time, probably involving some level of experimentation, stuff that's going to give you an operational edge? And then how do you do it fast? Because Moore's law applies to more than just the capacity of a circuit chip. It applies to the technology that's out there, all these things. And to me, the epiphany or the aha moment was in January 2014. I went to this thing called Singularity University out in the West Coast. And a guy named Ray Kurzweil, who was a Hewlett-Packard guy and developed, I think, first printer. He was, a technologist back in the 70s. He wrote a book called The Singularity is Near. And basically, his hypothesis is that eventually artificial intelligence will equal to and surpass that of human intelligence. And then what are the ethical and moral, legal decisions or rules or policies you have to put in place? I mean, we're already seeing that. And so what's the liability if you have an autonomous self-driving car and you get in an accident and you're a passenger? Are you liable? How do you ensure that? And so there are all sorts of practical things. But at this school for a week, I sat there with mostly civilian business people, entrepreneurs, biochemists, technologists, cybersecurity people. And we were exposed at that time, that was 7 years ago, to the latest and greatest technologies, many of which are already fielded or continuing to be advanced, from, better energy, alternative energy, autonomous vehicles, robotics, additive manufacturing, 3D printing, artificial or virtual reality. And it opened my eyes because you don't know what you don't know. It's these things that were being developed and have now become reality. And so, I mean, that's the dilemma. I mean, you see that in the services struggling with, okay, how do I maintain a legacy force? Or what portion of legacy force do I keep? How much do I invest in it? What do I divest myself from? Because I can't afford to sustain what I have and at the same time invest in a newer, greater capability. And so there's going to be, and then you have to level that against risk. How much risk are you willing to take? So the good news is the world is not a great place, but we don't have tens or hundreds of thousands of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine in Iraq and Afghanistan anymore. We have global commitments, and there are world actors out there that are doing things which are illegal or potentially illegal or violation of sovereignty of our allies and friends. So how do you support them, and how do you provide deterrence in a forward deployed force? Because we don't want a home game. We don't want another 9/11. And at the same time, take the monies. If you do reduce your legacy capability, as some of the services have done, and how do you get the Congress to allow you to take that money and keep it and reinvest it? And then how do you reinvest it in a way where it is an integrated, interoperable capability with the other services, so we don't have to worry about trying to figure out how we're going to at least communicate with each other if and when we were to go forward to fight another overseas operation, whatever it is, across the range of operations, whether it be a humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, whether it be an insurgency where we're supporting a host nation against a threat, and even the terrorist threat. The terrorist threat has not gone away. It's moved and it's morphed, and even that particular group or groups has become much more technologically advanced with the use of drones and automation and encryption, and become very sophisticated in how they do things. So it's a very difficult question. And so some tough decisions are going to have to be made. And some people are going to be unhappy about those decisions. But the one thing we can't do is we can't do nothing.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that is a difficult balance. I thought your comment about the budget was particularly insightful, because that is always the challenge too, is the balance of, hey, if you do divest yourself of something, it can be difficult not to people to see that as a windfall to be used for other purposes. So thank you very much for that, sir. So, sir, I have to get after this one because I've had the good privilege of serving with you twice overseas, and in both times in an urban environment. And the United States has predicted that 68% of the world population is projected to live in urban areas by 2050. And going a little bit back in time and talked about Vietnam, I recently read a book by Mark Bowden that covered the battle for Hue during the 1968 Tet Offensive. And as I said, you and I served together in Mogadishu, Somalia, then again in Iraq. And I think you'd agree that conflict in urban centers has been, and probably will continue to be, a daunting challenge. What advances have we made in recent years, and where do you think we should focus our efforts for the future? I think both, we don't have to constrain to kinetic, but I am curious as to, based on your experience, your recent experience, your past experience, our history, where do you think we should focus, given that idea that the majority of people are going to be living in urban centers within the next decade or so?
Well, again, a difficult challenge. One of the advantages of a town, a village, a city, or an urban center is it's dependent upon where it is. I mean, and it depends upon the nature of the fight. I mean, if we're talking one military, more conventional, whatever conventional is these days, force moves into town, and they're wearing uniforms and you're wearing uniforms, you could try to remove the civilians and have a fight. But none of them will all leave. Like, wait, there were civilian casualties there, just like there have been civilian casualties in any urban fight that's taken place on this earth. If you can't get the civilians out of there, or one side or the other won't let the civilians leave. And so that makes it difficult. there are, being able to, and if the adversary is not wearing a uniform and they're dressed like civilians, then how do you figure out who they are? And the one thing you could do, I mean, and it's being discussed right now, I mean, artificial intelligence allows you the ability to do certain levels of recognition. And if you had a database of facial recognition, you think about all the people that we did the biometrics on, of iris scans and fingerprints. In that database has got to be out there somewhere. But you could photograph people. I think there are certain nations on this earth who use this capability. Many of our urban centers have had large use of video cameras to surveil high crime areas. And when they've done this, the data shows, at least what I've read, that the crime goes down because people that were willing to commit this type of act knew that their ability to do this without being identified, even without artificial intelligence doing facial recognition, there was some way to identify them or at least give a clue to who they were. And so, there will be ways to identify people, but another thing that's going to happen is if and when there were a decision in a nation state to allow the use of this capability, many people would just probably wear a mask. Peter Singer and his partner have written a number of great books about the future, and I would commend them to anybody. Ghost Fleet was the first one. Then he wrote Like War, which was a discussion about the potential, or not the potential, the huge capability and power of social media and social media networks. And then he's recently written one that's out in the future even more, called Burn In, where you get a chance, at least how they envision or postulate how the world might look in the United States in the next 25 or 30 years. And the story revolves around an FBI agent who's given a robot to be her partner. And she's supposed to train the robot, hence the term burn in. Like you burn in your comms, you run with the robot, and the robot, because it's based on artificial intelligence, has the ability to learn and evolve and become more capable once it gets experiences and uses the human almost as a coach, mentor, trainer. So back to your question, fighting in a city gives you, if you're trying to be successful or trying not to be targeted, it makes the targeting situation much, much, much more difficult. It's much easier to target on an open desert or a lowly populated area. It's not necessarily totally easy because you can still camouflage. But because of the geometry in the city and the ability of communications, I mean, you can put a camera everywhere, but you still have the ability to move, if you're smart, move with some level of freedom. And so that would be the most difficult fight. And that's, why would you fight there? Well, because maybe that's where the people live, and if the people are at risk, you would have to do certain things to try to secure that. Because if the economy is based on economy in the city, even if there's people growing or building stuff on the periphery, that's where the market is. That's where the fight's going to be, and so it'll be very, very challenging. And it's close quarters. You're targeting. Rules of engagement become much, much, much more strenuous and rigorous because you don't want to create civilian casualties. And just the whole urban canyon idea makes things incredibly difficult. And the Marine Corps' credit, they wrote a classified and unclassified version about, how about this particular problem and the urban sprawl and the number of mega cities that are going to grow and develop, that are already growing and develop. And people live near the coast because that's where trade is, because trade travels by the sea, and that's where the markets are. And so there's work there, and people come to the city to work. So, you and I remember, because you were an Army armor officer, we're not taking our tanks to town, right? We don't want to go to town because it creates too many vulnerabilities for us. Well, that's fine, but you're going to have to go to town. I mean, if the adversary, the enemy, is holding a civilian population center of your citizens, and you have to free them, you're going to have to go to town with whatever capability you have. And it has historically been a very difficult, high casualty, high collateral damage fight. And it's always been that way. And I'm not so sure that unless we develop some sort of weapons that are going to be legal and ethically acceptable, that will not continue to be that way.
Yes, sir. And I think that the adversaries have certainly been watching over the years the challenges associated with it. And I think that the concept of megacities is a good one. I appreciate your comment about the urban canyons because it ties back to what you talked about earlier about networks. You want to be networked, yet you're in a situation where you have a blackout. Again, a complex problem that the second, third order effects of decisions that we make. So thank you, sir.
This has been part 1 of the interview with the 37th Commandant of the United States Marine Corps podcast. The conversation with General Robert Neller, retired, continues where it left off in part 2, which can be found on the HDIAC website.